Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links is the free-to-play mobile and PC game based on the game Yu-Gi-Oh! Of course, but it doesn't really play like traditional Yu-Gi-Oh! Which we will go more into in the gameplay bit of course, but the basic idea here is changing the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! In such a way that it makes it overall a shorter game for that more casual and kinda quicker experience for the mobile format. Now, why am I reviewing this given I mostly review paid console slash PC single player games with a beginning and an ending? And this is a free to play, primarily mobile game, which is kind of, in my opinion, one of the furthest things I could review from my usual stuff. And I'll be honest, I didn't do this for any kind of noble cause, I don't know, or because I wanted to challenge myself as a reviewer. No, no, no. I really just decided to review it because I have put a lot of time into this game in the last few weeks and I felt like I had to review it, so I feel my time was slightly less wasted. And of course, that I feel that I understand the game enough to review it, since, of course, because it's a mobile game, it doesn't really have a point where the credits start rolling. So let's get into the actual review. Starting with the story. Well, like most free to play mobile games, there isn't really a story, just ample amounts of flavored text, where characters will say something like, I bet you can't beat me, haha, stuff like that. You know the type of stuff no one reads in these games. The most story you get in this game is through these seasonal events where usually a character is introduced in an antagonistic way and you have to defeat them, and the event usually trying to add some variation to the gameplay, which of course we will talk a bit about later. More important here though is that during these events there are specific cutscenes to the event, but once again it's also very much that nothing dialogue. So, story, not really. Let's get into the gameplay, which is, of course, the main thing here. And for starters, let's explain the rules. Here, like I said before, it is a cut down version of Yu Gi Oh! But because I know many might not even know the regular rules of Yu Gi Oh!, I'll try to explain it in a simple surface level way, as I don't think it is worth going into much detail, as a lot of it you do learn while playing. So, basic concept, Duel Links is a trading card game which somehow I failed to mention so far, where basically there are three main types of cards: trap cards, spell cards, and monster cards. And within these types of cards, there are several types, which once again I won't go into much detail, but an example would be, for example, continuous trap cards, which stay on the field doing whatever it says on the text. Another example would be equip spells, where it attaches itself to a monster card and has some kind of effect, with basic ones being as simple as adding attack or defense, but also being able to have much more complex or specific abilities to certain cards. That thing about cards being very specific is a big part of Yu-Gi-Oh! With synergy, which is basically cards' powers working together to make something more powerful, which I guess is a big part of most trading card games, but more on that later, maybe. Basically, with spells and traps, it's a case of it does what it says on the text. I would say the major difference is traps in general can only be activated the turn after they were set on the field, while in general spell cards can be immediately used from the hand. And from the outside you'd think then why use traps, but at least here in Duel Links, generally they are a defense against your opponent, strategy, things that negate or destroy cards during that time where you can really play from your hand. Of course, because of how Yu-Gi-Oh has evolved, a lot of this has changed throughout the years, and there are exceptions to all of this, and I can even imagine that some experienced players of regular Yu-Gi-Oh probably laugh with their decks that probably don't even run any traps. But as we go to talk about monsters, it's important to understand that Duel Links is not the same set of rules or even has the same cards as regular Yu-Gi-Oh! As here, Duel Links has only reached XYZ summons, which don't worry, I will broadly explain it a bit. While regular Yu-Gi-Oh! Is of the making of this video a few years into Link monsters, who have very much defined the modern game and how it's played, but I'm not gonna go into it because I'm no expert and also it doesn't really matter here. Also, I don't know if they will ever add these new cards to the game due to the nature of Duel Links and how its field works. Regardless, getting back to the review, at most basic there are two types of monsters, normal monsters and effect monsters, where normal monsters is basically as basic as it gets. It's a monster with attack and defense and numbers of stars that determine its level, which determines if it needs a tribute or not to summon. And if you do need to tribute, also how many tributes you need to do. For example, a level 5 card only requires 1 tribute, but a 7-star one requires 2. And usually, especially with normal monsters, the higher the level, then the higher the attack and or defense, and that's really all they have going for them. And speaking of attack and defense, I think it is important to mention here, as it's often easy to forget as something everybody knows, but if you're a newcomer, there isn't really any way for you to know unless you've watched someone play, and that's basically that there can be 3 states on the field, and that is attack position, where a monster can attack, and the number that matters is the attack one for whenever an attack is made, or when 2 monsters fight, for example. It is the attack points against the other attack points, not attack versus defense as it might be in other TCGs. And generally speaking, in a fight between 2 monsters, in attack position, whoever loses suffers the difference between attack points of the 2 monsters as life points, and their monster is also destroyed. You can also just attack your opponent's life points directly if they have nothing defending them, or if your card says you can do that, which by the way in this game is 4,000 against the 8,000 of regular Yu-Gi-Oh!, which again adding to that downsized experience. Which in defense position also happens, except you do not suffer any damage to your life points for the most part, as I have to say this because to most basic Yu-Gi-Oh rules there is an exception with some cards, but this exception happens to be a very well known one, and that is called piercing damage, which will still cause the damage on the difference, in this case between attack and defense, on the enemy's life points. Also important to mention is if you attack a monster in defense position and your attack is lower than that defense, then you suffer the difference regardless of having piercing damage or not. And the main reason this might happen is attacking a monster in the final state that they can be in on the field, which is set down in defense position. Cards cannot be set down in attack position, and for reference in Yu-Gi-Oh! Spell cards and trap cards do not have positions, so they just set down straight, I guess. But regardless, the reason you would want to set a monster like this would be of course to obfuscate whatever you're putting on the field, but also activate flip summons, which is an effect some cards have when they activate a certain effect when they get well flipped. And I commented that trap cards go unused in regular Yu-Gi-Oh! But even here in Duel Links, it's very rare to see any deck with a flip summon effect in any competitive capacity. And it makes sense given how slow it is to activate, which I guess I'll talk a bit more when we get to the multiplayer bit maybe. But getting back to the effect monsters, there is not much to say without going into it in depth. I guess they're basically monster cards with spell effects, which once again can be simple, and broad, but also incredibly specific, which could even affect how they get summoned. For example, certain effect monsters can only be summoned through a special summon, which doesn't count as a summon. And that matters because you can only normal summon one monster per turn, and with special summon that means you can basically overcome that. And so basically if you special summon before, you can still normal summon after, and if you normal summon, then you can only special summon after. Unless of course there is a card that overrides this in some way. Now, to complicate this a bit more, let's talk about the other monsters that can be either normal or effect, but I'll be honest, most of them will be effect monsters. Starting with the classic one, the fusion monsters. These work by mixing two or more monsters together, either on your hand or field, once again, generally speaking, and fusing them with a magic or trap card, with the most famous one being polymerization. These cards have a distinct purple color, different from the more reddish purple of the trap cards. Then we have another similar to the fusion one, also working by using monsters and spell cards to summon, except unlike the rest of the cards we talk about here, they don't sit in the extra deck, which is a separate deck from your regular deck that holds these special cards, except for this one, which does end up making it one of its biggest disadvantage of ritual cards, as they usually need to be in your hand and can just be called when the circumstances are met. And as to what these cards look like, honestly, as a kid, I really liked the design of them, and that's because of their blue color, which at the time before a lot of the other special cards showed up, it was a very standout color for a Yu-Gi-Oh card. And now let's move on to the other cards that probably people who grew up with the original anime don't remember, because most of these came out probably after they left. I, for a long time, only knew these cards because of the PSP video games, and that is Synchro Summons. These are white cards and they don't need spell cards. Instead, you have to mix tuner and non-tuner monsters, which were also a new addition to the game back when these cards were introduced, on the field, and also the stars of these monsters have to add up to the ones of the synchro monster. And of course you must also match the text of the synchro cards, as some synchro cards may say something like it requires more than two monsters, or monsters with specific names, which sounds confusing, and honestly it used to be, but you do end up learning it and it's not that hard once you understand them. And also, it makes sense that they do have to have some more complicated summoning requirements, because they are so easy to summon in a way, only needing monsters, and also because they have very powerful effects. In my experience, synchro monsters are some of the most powerful ones in the game right now, mostly because there aren't many of our next final cards that are the XYZ summons. These are black cards and they are still relatively new to the game here in Duel Links. And these work very much like Synchro Monsters, where you join summon monsters from your extra deck using only monsters on the field, while meeting the requirements, which in this case are primarily mixing monsters with the same levels. Like for example, a 3-star XZ will usually have the requirement of 2 or more level 3 monsters to summon it. And the other big difference is when these cards are summoned, the monsters used to summon it do not go to the graveyard like most other types of summons in this game. Instead, they are stacked with the XYZ on top, and basically this serves so that the effect of this card will work around spending the stacked cards, which means they end up having very powerful effects that can only be used a few times. Now let's talk about the field, which will hopefully give some context to the things I said, and make it a bit simpler. So basically, the Duel Links board is a cut down version of the regular Yu-Gi-Oh board, where instead of 5 slots for monsters and other 5 slots for spells and traps, there are instead 3 for each. And also adding to that, there is a deck zone which instead of making decks between 40 and 80 cards, you make decks between 20 and 30. And then most of everything else is about the same, with an extra deck which is for your fusion, synchros and XYZ cards, a graveyard where your monsters and used spell cards go to, then an unmarked place next to that where your banished cards go. But I don't think it's worth going into what a banished card is or why that happens, so I'm gonna skip that and go to the other side of the board where we have our field spell zones, which I'm not really gonna go into. It's just another type of spell card. It's a continuous one by nature and usually has some significant effect on the whole board. Only one of the players can have a field spell on, so for example, if your opponent has a field spell and you use your own field spell, then it will destroy theirs and vice versa. Also, the final thing that isn't really on the board, but it's part of it I guess, and that is also cut down from the main game, is the phases. Basically, there are phases when different things can be done, like attacking during your battle phase or set and play cards during your main phase, or a phase to draw cards called the draw phase. And the main difference here is there is no main phase 2, which usually would happen after the battle phase. And what that means for Duel Links is that you don't get a moment to change things after you have done combat, which is a big deal. It emphasizes the importance of the battle phase and the stakes in it, which end up probably being the biggest difference in terms of how much it changes the gameplay compared to full Yu-Gi-Oh! And that's about it, I guess. If it wasn't obvious when I said there is monster slots and spell trap slots, that's because they have different separate slots they go in, but spells and trap cards do share the same slots. And all monsters share their slots, which is a bit different now in regular Yu-Gi-Oh, but you don't have to worry about that here. Which I think it's a great thing here, as it feels that despite the complexity that Yu-Gi-Oh has taken over the years, this version is still fairly accessible to newcomers while still giving an experience that is enjoyable to maybe the more hardcore crowd, as this feels like fast Yu-Gi-Oh! And not so much dumbed down Yu-Gi-Oh!, even if some ways it might be. Now let's talk about the features of this game outside of the basic gameplay. So the basic game outside of the events is very simple. You complete objectives set by each stage by playing against the AI on the world map, so to say, and the objectives could be here things like win 10 games or use 5 spell cards or inflict X amount of damage, or important here, get X amount of assessment score. Assessment score is a thing here in Duel Links where it gives you a points rating based on your duel, and it basically judges things like how many turns did it take, how many monsters did you summon, and how much damage did you do, with some special conditions doing the bulk of the points, like a quick victory being 1000 points, or attacking with a monster with more than 5000 attack, that's like more 1800 points. And the reason you'd want a high assessment score outside of just completing objectives is also because the drops you get from that duel are based on that score, so the higher the score, the higher the chances are of a better reward, which I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of because it makes it so the game optimally is focused on creating a deck to farm this higher score than having a good or fast deck, which personally is a bit annoying, I think. Regardless, getting back to the stages, completing objectives themselves awards you with different prizes, and then completing the stages itself not only moves you to the next one, but also refills the world, as you usually only have a certain number of AI to play against before you have to wait for it to refresh, which is a very mobile game thing. Your other incentive to progress in the stages is characters and also unlocking higher difficulties. Basically, at different stages, new characters will show up and allow you to complete their objectives, which then allow you to unlock them and play as them and receive some of their cards sometimes. The thing with characters here is that they're not just cosmetic, as one of the unique things about Duel Links and the way it plays is the skills, which each character has their own skills, which can be very helpful for specific decks or just be generally helpful. Like one might let you start a duel with extra life points, or another one is more specific and it adds a couple of cards to your deck and maybe an ability involving those cards added. Like for example, with Kaiba and his Blue Eyes, you can get an ability that adds a Blue Eyes Twin Dragon, which is a fusion monster mixing two Blue Eyes White Dragons, and also gives you the ability to get a polymerization when you have two Blue Eyes in your hand. And then because of that, being able to immediately summon Blue Eyes Twin Dragon, or if you want to take advantage of this ability, even summon other Blue Eyes if you have those cards. Like for example, if you just happen to have 3 Blue Eyes, you could use this ability to summon Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, since this ability is only trying to meet requirements that would let you do those summons, but it isn't forcing you to summon the specific card it's giving you. And so you can probably see how that would be very helpful. And because of that, that's a really big reason why would you want to unlock new characters and also level them up to unlock different abilities. Which thankfully the level up process is a lot simpler, as all you have to do is duel to level them up, even if it does get grindy at a point. Now, the other thing that is unlocked even before you unlock the character is their portal. And this is one of the sections of the game where you can play against the AI of this character and their decks. And the main reason to do this here is of course unlocking them, as a lot of characters unlocking requirements will be something relating to battle them in some way, and being able to find them at the portal is a lot easier than having to wait for them to just randomly spawn on the map, which even when they do spawn on the map, which is already kind of rare to get the one you want, they might also just not spawn at the level you want them, since you can't pick the difficulty you play against them on, and that sometimes is part of the challenge. Another reason to play against them though is also just acquiring their cards, which adds with the difficulty option I just spoke about, as the higher the difficulty you can play against them, the higher the chances of getting their more rare cards. Now, the game has been around for a while and there are stages for each world, which I have yet to mention. There is a world for each Yu-Gi-Oh era, so original, GX, 5D, Zexals, and also the movie one, funny enough. And like I said, each one of them has their own separate stages. So my advice here is, if you are new to the game, you want to focus on a single stage to get the difficulties, because unlocking them in one place unlocks them for all the other worlds. And then only reach stage 10 or 11 in each world, since that's all you need to be able to unlock all the characters in each world. Now, there are more characters outside of these tied to events, but I want to talk about the world first. Basically here there are 4 main areas where the AI spawns, but each area also has the respective views. The first one is the portal, which I already explained, but also there is the tutorial here and the challenge area. Basically here you can do some puzzle duels where there is a very specific way to beat the game and you have to figure it out. It's a surprisingly good way to get to know some of the more complex ideas within Yu-Gi-Oh! And also you can play what they call loner decks here, where you have to win a duel with a specific deck against another very specific deck. and you usually have to learn to use that loner deck and its tactics to beat that other deck that's played by the AI. And honestly, I really liked this. When I got back into playing this game, I did not stop until I had completely exhausted all of them. That being said, while they are very cool, they also only add new ones once in a blue moon. But if you are just now entering for the first time, then there is already a big collection of them. And you even get rewarded in gems, the microtransaction currency of this game, for completing them. More on that later. Also, sorry for saying more on that later so much, but this is a very long review for me. Then we have our next area, the multiplayer area, which is very self-explanatory, but also, I'm sorry to say this again, I plan on going into it a bit more later. But anyways, moving on, we have the shops next, which obviously you can buy cards and decks. And now talking a bit more about the monetization of this game, I will say the good first. Which is first, there aren't any ads. I guess the whole game is one big ad for Yu-Gi-Oh, but that's fine. But honestly, I've had so many bad experiences in which mobile games are just ruined by constant ads, and this one doesn't do that, which is good. Another good thing is that the paid currency gems can be acquired through normally playing the game in a fairly decent amount if your objective is to play casually. Now to the not so good. Well, like a lot of free to play games, there is just too many currencies for different things like keys that allow you to play against characters on the portal, or coins and attributes that allow you to trade for cards, and of course, this can all be overcome with real money. And the reason for this to be so divided in different currencies is, in my opinion, to keep control of how much the players have, and also I would say like a fail-safe in case they accidentally create a way in which you could exploit one of these currencies, and then they would still be locked down by the fact you need the other currencies to go along with them, which, while good for their business, just makes this really tedious work. Overall though, it's really not the worst thing ever, which is surprising, I guess. Moving on, still in the shops area, you have the merchant that allows you to buy specific cards and even skills and keys which replenish every day with new stock. So it's something you want to check out every time you log in, just to see if there is a new card you want or need, but again, all the different currencies, blah 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 blah. Moving on then to the final area, which is just the deck edit zone. They call it studio, but that's really all. You can change decks and characters, which is kinda useless because you can do either of those things from different areas. Now let's talk about the events, and these usually introduce new characters or bring back old characters and basically have new ways to play the game. And your incentive to play this new style of game will of course be getting the character and also a ton of rewards you get from playing the event. Also just the new game modes, like for example the current event focus on Duke Devlin, the dungeon dice monster guy from the anime, and his special duel you get to set the dice and get a special effect that can really twist the game around, and that's pretty fun. Or for example the previous event that was based on the 5D series, and it tried to replicate the idea of playing on motorcycles, of course, within the limitations of this game. You don't actually get to drive anything, don't get the wrong idea, but still really fun in my experience. And it's a reason to come back to the game after you somewhat exhausted the base game, as I kinda have. There are also smaller events that just happen within the game by you playing it normally, like the current mission circuit, which gives you points after your duel, and based on those points a little character will do laps around the track, and the more laps you do the more rewards you get, which do incentivize you play the base game even when you might be bored of it, I guess. Which, when I say it like that, it does sound a bit mischievous, like the game is trying to keep you addicted to it, and that is an issue with these games and how they are built, but oh well. Now, how often do these events change? Well, it seems to be about every other week, which is enough time for you to exhaust the event and also get bored of it, in my opinion. So, the events end up being a really cool thing in this game, so yeah, if you play them, participate in them, even if you're still kind of a noob. Mostly because of rewards, really. Now, let's actually get into the multiplayer bit. Basically, there are three main modes, sometimes more with events, but the basic one are casual and friends play, where you can just play well casually against other players. Then rooms, where you can make a room and enter a room with other players and just make your own little tournaments maybe and change small rules. Nothing crazy, just stuff like changing the number of limited cards you can have. And it's okay, I guess. I'll be honest, I never play these ones. They're just not a huge reason for me to do so. Since you don't really get a lot of rewards from playing them, it is really just for you to be able to play with your friends maybe. The real important one here then is the ranked duels, basically competitive duel links, and this is where you play to try and defeat people who should be within the same skill level as you, hopefully, and as you rise in the ranks to try and become King of Games, which is a cool name, yes. But I have to be honest here, while I think you could reach this rank as a free-to-play player, I think it would be a horrible grind to get a deck good enough to do that, and you would have to be working on it since you enter the game to waste as little gems as possible. And even once you do that, then when the meta changes, you would just be left behind because you exhausted all the gems you could get for free. Because a deck that is competitive this season might not be a few months from now. And I'm telling you this as someone who's been around from day one. And so because I've also been around since day one, playing on and off, I also have to say that in my experience, this has also been the best time for free-to-play players in the competitive area. As within my on and off experience of this game, I feel I've noticed three eras when I was playing, and this is not by any means scientific or even accepted by any community, but this is how I felt as, once again, coming back to the game through the years and taking big breaks in between them. And so, first, when the game came out, it was very much pay to win, no joke. When the game started off, very basic with the OG Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and well, you got way less gems, and so getting good competitive cards was so hard, and I felt that people who paid had a serious advantage. Then when I came back to the game a few years later, there was a deck that was fairly easy to build if you were a free-to-play player that even I ran. This was a cheap deck, anyone playing the game could really get enough gems to build, is what I'm trying to say, and it was good enough to take them to legendary rank, which is the rank just before King of Games, which is a special rank which you get by winning 5 games in a row at the max level of legendary rank, which in my opinion at the time was a big deal for any free-to-play deck to be able to do that so easily. And that was the Sylvian deck era, as I call it, and basically if you had any deck that opposed it, basically you had a King of Games deck. And who had decks like that? Well, people that pay. And now, even more years later, the game has definitely gotten so much more cards and archetypes, and deck variety just has gone up a lot, and it solves one of the biggest problems with the other 2 times I've played, which I felt like the decks that were competitively viable could be counted on your fingers and ended up feeling like you're just playing against the same decks over and over again. And don't get me wrong, this still happens now, like I'm very much tired of playing against resonator decks, but it's so much better now than it used to be. While I don't play as much competitive as I used to because I still feel is a bit on the pay to win side, when I do, at least I feel like there is a chance to encounter a new and interesting deck over a deck where I know the outcome already depending on the hand I get, Also, I feel like there is just a lot more free to play decks, so to say, in which a free to play player could easily build them and have some kind of competitive chance. And so, because of that, you don't just see an influx of the same deck in competitive like you did with Sylvians. Regardless though, I will say the game has evolved a lot and it's never been a better time to get into the game, I think, which I'm happy for. And I'm happy that the game didn't just die or become pay to win hell. And it hasn't, because as a free to play player, I have been still having fun regardless. And that is it for the gameplay. Yup, this is already one of my biggest videos ever and it's not even over yet, but now with the graphics, which won't be long. Basically, well, it's a phone game, but it's a nice phone game. 2D art is surprisingly sharp and the cards look good, except for the rarities. The shininess that is trying to imitate the real life shininess of the cards looks really lame in my opinion, as it's just like a regular card, but it has a weird shine over the whole card, which is very lame because in real life cards they are mostly just in the art or in specific places that kind of give a nice touch to them, and here it's like, just put it all over the card. Then the other thing is, it's cool that depending on what world you are, the enemies match the world. Like in GX, they are students because GX take place in a school, but then the backgrounds all look a bit too similar. I just wish that they looked more like the worlds they take place in. I get that they need to keep the standard because they all have to have the same 4 areas, but the backgrounds could be different in my opinion. Even the foreground could be different and still express the same idea of what the place is, in my opinion. And that's about it though. There is also like 3D animations for when you summon certain special cards, which is cool, and it gives me nostalgia for the PSP games that did the same thing, which I somehow managed to bring up twice in this review. But let's be honest, you are going to watch that animation once and then skip it every other time, or even beyond that, turn them off in the options, which you can do. And in fact, tech wise, this game can just turn off a whole lot of its visual flair and make it just play out a lot faster, which is something you'll want to do, especially on mobile, where all that is just battery consuming. Also, speaking of platforms, this game is on mobile and PC, and while I prefer to play on PC due to it just running faster, I don't have the greatest phone out there. There aren't really any advantages to playing in that 16:9 mode on PC. As you can probably see in the gameplay, the extra bars of space really just give you more information, which you can already do on the phone version, but you don't have to slide to see it here, I guess. The only place where it does take advantage of it is when building decks, which is slightly better on PC because of that extra space, but it is still just like having like 2 phone screens next to each other. Now, the final thing to say about this is the game crashes a lot, but it's fine. Well, it's not fine, but it's just that I never really lost progress because of it, so I don't really care if it happened during a duel. I would just log into the duel again and get right back into it without losing progress. And in other situations, it hardly mattered. Now, soundtrack wise, it's okay. That's all I'm gonna say because I'll be honest, I mostly play this game muted. Now, even on PC, I don't care to hear it. It's not that it sounds bad, and there is even some good sound effects, but I've just been playing this game too much and it just ends up becoming distracting. And when I play this game on PC, I must be honest, I'm also just watching or doing other stuff now. Like, no joke, I ended up playing this game like 2 times while writing this review, which is probably why I can't get anything done. Anyways, overall, it's okay. And overall, this game has a lot going for it, I think. It's more than okay, but it's also a bad addiction, let's be honest. And while there is a lot going for it and I really enjoy it, there is also a lot of tedious things going for it, with the grind, and while the game has gotten better at it though through the years, it still could be much better. And I didn't even mention how dumb the AI for the random enemies is, and how there is an autoplay feature, because I don't think it's something a new player should really care about, but it is something you're gonna end up using. But even the AI of the autoplay is not particularly good. Also, well, if you've been watching the review, then you've been looking at it the whole time, so I don't think that was a huge reason to talk about it. Anyways, now what do I rate this game? Well, from my experience, which I guess is how reviews work, I am giving Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links a 7 out of 10. Yup, it's a pretty high score for me, but I'm a Yu-Gi-Oh! Kid, okay? It's an anime and a card game I grew up with, and I really enjoy it, and I feel Duel Links gives me that in such an easy to consume way that I really enjoyed as well. Recommendations wise though, well, it's free, so play it if you're new to Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a good entry point since it is simpler, and this will also just give you all the bases if you ever want to move on to the real thing, if that's something you even want to do. Now, if you are a returning player or a pro, then sure, if you're looking for something new within the Yu-Gi-Oh! Sphere, but to be honest, if you're a pro or a Yu-Gi-Oh! Big Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan, you probably already tried this game. But if you're an anime fan, then yeah, totally, this might be something that gives you a lot of nostalgia, as it has all the characters, and you can play them without having to worry about microtransactions, which also surprising. I don't know why these things have to be surprising, but it is. It's a surprisingly fair game, which is saying a lot about both mobile games and Konami. So, yeah, regardless of your decision then to play this game, I guess, I hope that you enjoyed watching, and if so, please consider subscribing and liking and commenting, all things you can do for free here on YouTube. And regardless of that, I hope you're having a good day, and goodbye.